Well, we're off to a fantastic start this year, and we're going to talk about completing the square one final time. Now, we've added 2 extra steps in. We're going to really focus on solving after we complete the square, and we're going to focus on our leading coefficients. Now, there's about 8 or 9 examples, and we want to see every single example in your notebook. They're all going to be just a tad bit different. Alright, so we're going to talk about completing the square again. Now, I'm going to start with a pretty basic one, and then I'm going to make it a little uglier, something you haven't seen before. Alright, so remember, we're separating these terms. I'm going to rewrite this as x squared minus 8x, and I want to add a number, subtract a number, and then I have this plus 4 hanging out on the end. Alright, now, how did we complete the square? It's all about this term with the x. We took negative 8, we divided it by 2, so we cut it in half. Okay, that gets me a negative 4, and now we square it. Anytime you square something, you should be getting a positive number. So I'm going to, 4 squared of course is 16, I'm going to add 16 and subtract 16. Now here's the magic. Those first 3 terms should factor as a perfect square trinomial. So I'm going to say that's x minus 4 times x minus 4. Have you noticed that this term is always the number that you squared, including the sign? There's a little hint. And then I take these 2 and add them together. Okay, so I took care of the first 3. Now these 2 go together to get me my minus 12 equals 0. So now I can say I have the quantity x minus 4 squared minus 12 equals 0. Now we're not done until we solve for x. Our goal is to actually solve. So I have x minus 4 squared, remember isolate that term, equals 12. To get rid of a square, I'm going to take the square root. Don't forget you get a plus and minus. Those cancel. And I get x minus 4 equals plus or minus radical 12. Alright, now I've got to break down that radical. It's not simplified yet. So I get plus or minus. Radical 12 is really radical 4 times radical 3. And the radical 4 turns into the number 2. So x minus 4 equals plus or minus 2 radical 3. Now lastly, I have to solve for x, so I have to do one more step. I have to add that 4 over. So notice it's going to come in front of the plus or minus. It is 4 plus or minus 2 radical 3. Now I can't actually add those together because they're not like terms. This 4 does not have a radical 3. Just recall, you do have 2 answers. You have 4 plus 2 radical 3, and you have 4 minus 2 radical 3. Alright, so we're going to introduce you to a new step in completing the square. Alright, so this is not an option. We want this boxed in your notebook, nice and neat. If you've got some colored pencils, markers, do something to highlight this. This is brand new to everybody. Alright, so in completing the square, the leading coefficient must be a 1. Alright, now what the heck do I mean by that? Well, the number in front of the x squared, okay, that's called a coefficient. Alright, that's just a fancy word for number in front. The number in front of x squared must be the number 1. Well, what do you do if it's not? Here's the rule. If it's not a 1, divide all the terms by that number and complete the square. So if you haven't got that in your notebook yet, pause it, write it down, and we'll go through an example together. First example, 2x squared minus 12x plus 14 equals 0. Alright, now I want to complete the square, and the rule says this number in front of x squared has to be a 1. I need to see a 1 here. Well, again, what do you do if it's not? We just wrote it down. It says divide by that number. Now remember in math, you have to balance, so I have to divide every single term, and there are 4 of them. All 4 terms have to get divided by 2. Alright, so I will get, that becomes x squared minus 6x plus 7, and 0 divided by anybody is still 0. Now you complete the square. So let's run through those steps again. I'm going to rewrite it as x squared minus 6x. I'm going to add a number and subtract the same number, plus the 7 equals 0. How do we get that number? Well, we take that coefficient of x, the number in front of x, we cut it in half. Negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3, and then we square it. Remember, when you square, you should always get a positive number. Negative 3 squared is 9, so I'm going to add 9 and subtract 9. These first 3 terms, put a bracket around them. Those factor nicely. X minus 3 and x minus 3. Remember, it's the number you squared. Box these two in, add those together. Negative 9 plus 7 is negative 2 equals 0. Okay, we'll rewrite it. This is really x minus 3 squared minus 2 equals 0. And now we'll solve our equation. We want to get x alone. So x minus 3 squared equals 2. To get rid of a square root, don't forget the plus minus. X minus 3 equals plus or minus radical 2. Can you break your 2 down at all? Nope, it's simplified. So now we'll just add the 3 over. So I get x equals 3 plus or minus radical 2. Okay, notice this plus or minus is going to stay in front of the radical. That doesn't get split up, and the 3 comes in front of all that. And there you have it. Let's try another one. All right, next example. We'll walk through one more together, so take good notes, and then we're going to try some on your own. All right, I want to complete the square. This leading coefficient has to be a 1. So to get rid of that, I just divide every single term I have by 2. All right, so I get x squared plus 20x plus 40 equals 0. All right, now we're ready to complete the square. Take that middle term and we're going to cut it in half and square it. So I get x squared plus 20x. I want to add a number and subtract that number. Plus 40 equals 0. All right, let's figure out what that number is. Taking 20, cut it in half. I get 10. Square it. I want to add 100 and subtract 100. Okay, these first 3 terms should factor real nicely. X plus 10 and x plus 10. Add the next 2 terms. That gets me a negative 60 equals 0. So I can really say I have the quantity x plus 10 squared minus 60 equals 0. So you've completed the square. Now we're literally just doing a nice algebra equation. We're just solving for x. So I'm going to add that 60 over. X plus 10 squared equals 60. To get rid of a square, I'm going to square root both sides, and don't forget the plus minus. So I get x plus 10 equals plus or minus radical 60. All right, now I've got work to do on this one. I don't want to move my 10 over yet. I want to simplify my radical 60. So I've got x plus 10 equals, how can I break 60 down? Well, your gut might say 6 and 10, but neither of those are perfect squares. What can I use that's a perfect square? All right, and if you can't think of them, you have them written down or write them off in the side of your notebook. I'm thinking plus or minus, I think I would go with 4 times 15 would get me 60. So I get x plus 10 equals plus or minus, I know the 4 turns into a 2 radical 15. And lastly, I have one step, I just have to move that 10 over. Now remember, they're not like terms, they don't both have a radical 15. So I'm going to say that's a negative 10 plus or minus 2 radical 15. And there you have it. We've got our 2 answers. All right, third example. Negative x squared minus 2x plus 5 equals 0. Is that leading coefficient a 1? No, there's a negative 1 there. So take your time and divide each term by negative 1. So I get x squared plus 2x minus 5 equals 0. All right, pause it. Don't cheat yourself. Pause it, complete the square, and see if we get the same thing. If you can do this, you're in great shape. All right, I've got my work. I'll talk through it real quickly, and you can see if you've got the same answer, which I hope so. I took this 2, cut it in half, that's a 1, squared it, and I got 1. So I added 1 and subtracted 1. Together, this made x plus 1 and x plus 1. These two together made a minus 6. So this is the quantity x plus 1 squared, and I added that 6 to the other side. Took the square root of both sides, don't forget your plus minus. So I got x plus 1 equals plus or minus 6. Could not break radical 6 down, and then I just subtracted my 1 over. So I've got negative 1 plus radical 6 and negative 1 minus radical 6. All right, now this one looks familiar, I hope. We were pretty good at these. Notice this time you have an x squared and a y squared. So what shape do we have? Remember, 2 squared terms is a circle, and of course a circle is not a function. Now the same rule applies for circles. You can't complete the square unless this leading coefficient is a 1. So what do I have to go through and divide everybody I see by? Well, hopefully you've guessed it. You've got to divide everybody by 2. So this is the same problem with circles. So I get x squared plus 4x plus y squared minus 6y equals 2. All right, and we've done this part before. This is the old stuff. The only new stuff was dividing. And now we're going to complete the square. So we'll complete the square for the x's. We'll complete the square for the y's. So I've got x squared plus 4x. I want to add a number, subtract the same number, plus y squared minus 6y. Add a number, subtract the same number, equals 2. All right. When I complete the square for the x's, I'm taking that 4, dividing it by 2. That gets me 2, and 2 squared is 4. All right, so these 3 terms turn into x plus 2 and x plus 2. And I have this minus 4 hanging out. All right, I've only used these 3 terms. I'm going to do the same thing with my negative 6. Cut my negative 6 in half. I get negative 3. Square it, and I get 9. I'm going to add 9 and subtract 9. So those first 3 numbers turn into a y minus 3 and a y minus 3. I still have this minus 9 equals 2. All right, so it's just a little uglier. It's just 2 complete the squares in 1. And like I said, we've done all this before. So this is really x plus 2 squared with a minus 4. Plus this is really y minus 3 squared, because there's 2 of them. The minus 9 equals 2. And lastly, I'm just going to move a couple terms over. I'm going to add the 4 to this side, and I'm also going to add the 9 to this side. So I've got x plus 2 squared plus y minus 3 squared equals, let's see, 2 plus 4 is 6 plus 9 is 15. All right, so now this should clearly look like a circle, and let's just state our center and radius. Our center, based off this, is going to be negative 2, 3. Okay. Now let's be smart. This is not our radius. That is equal to r squared. Therefore, our radius, if I want to solve that, just take the square root of both sides. The radius is the square root of 15. Now that can't be broken down because no perfect squares go in there. All right, well, I've got another one for you. Again, this one's a circle, so it's a double complete the square. And just take note that that leading coefficient's not a 1 at the moment. All right, so you should have a pretty good idea of what to do. Pause it, try it on your own. Okay, this is where the learning comes in. Pause it, see how far you can get, and play me when you need to. Quick pick me up, I divided by 4. Hopefully you got the same thing. Again, pause it again, see how far you can get. Again, I just wanted to quickly show you my step there, make sure we're on the same page. I'm about to rewrite this and rewrite this. So pause it, see how you're doing. All right, so I've rewritten mine as my perfect squares. And lastly, I'm just going to move some terms over. I've got x plus 2 squared. I'm going to add the 4 to this side. Okay, so that kills that. Plus my y plus 1 squared, and I'm going to add this 1 over, equals 5. So I can clearly state that my center is negative 2, negative 1. My radius squared is equal to 5, so my radius is the square root of 5. So hopefully not too shabby. Like I said, we've done completing the square for a while now. We just added in that first step of dividing. All right, this next example happens once in a while. All right, now watch what happens. I have to divide every term by, you've guessed it, by 2 right now. And what's ugly about this? Have you figured it out yet? Is 3 nicely divisible by 2? It's not. I actually have to leave that as a 3/2. Okay? It's not pretty, but that's just what's going to happen. Every now and then you're going to get a number that doesn't divide nicely. All right, and it's nothing to worry about. You just got to go with it. Notice I'm not using any crazy decimals. All right, I'm leaving it as a fraction. And I'm still going to play the game. All right, so I've got x squared plus 3 over 2x. Okay, I'm going to add a number, I'm going to subtract a number, and I have this minus 3 hanging out. All right, now the only problem is you might want your calculator to help you divide this, that's all. Okay, it's nothing scary. Like I said, you just might want your calculator. You're still doing the same thing. You're taking this number with the x, so let's jot it down, 3/2, and you're still going to divide that by 2. You have to cut it in half. All right, so I suggest grab your calculator, put this in a fraction, 3 divided by 2, divided by 2. So I'm taking this 3/2 and cutting it in half, dividing it by 2. The only thing you can really screw up is not putting your fraction in parentheses on your calculator. All right, when I do that, I get 3/4. Okay, now your calculator screen might say 0.75. Okay, hit Math Frac, and that will put it in a fraction for you. All right, Math Frac, the very first thing in there will put it as a fraction. So the rule is you cut it in half, now you have to square it. So now I'm going to take 3/4, put it in parentheses on your calculator, and square it. Now we all know squaring fractions is easy. You simply square the top and square the bottom. So I'm going to, 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16. I need to add 9 over 16 and subtract 9 over 16. Okay, it's not any more difficult, it's just a little uglier. All right, now I have to still rewrite this as something factored. All right, so I know it's x and x. Now remember, if you've paid any attention, it's always the number that you what? Square. It's always the number that you square. And the number I squared was 3/4. So I have to put my 3/4 in there. All right, how do you know if you're right? Well, you need a fraction that multiplies to 9 over 16. 3 times 3 is 9, 4 times 4 is 16. And then I still have my minus 9/16 minus 3 equals 0. So I can rewrite this as x plus 3/4 squared. Okay, I'm just going to use my calculator to add this. Don't freak out, just type it in the calculator. Negative 9/16, use parentheses, minus 3, and again, Math Frac will put it back into a fraction. We don't want any crazy decimals. I get negative 57 over 16. All right, we're just going to go with it. So now I have x plus 3/4 squared equals 57 over 16. All right, I need to square root both sides. Don't forget the plus minus. X plus 3/4 equals plus or minus. Now remember, when you square root a fraction, you're doing it to the top and the bottom. Square root of 57 over the square root of 16. So that's x plus 3/4 equals plus or minus. Which of those do you know? That becomes a 4. That's the square root of 57. And then I'll just add my term over, or subtract in this case. I get negative 3/4 plus or minus radical 57 over 4. And there you have it. All right? All right, I'm going to walk you through one last ugly one together. All right, so pause it when you need to. If I talk too fast, slow me down when you need to. Notice my leading coefficient's a 1, so I don't have to divide anybody. I'm just going to take that middle term, cut it in half, and square it. Now, it's not going to be pretty again. Negative 5 divided by 2, and square it. Okay, you don't even need a calculator to square. Square the top, square the bottom. I get a positive 25 over 4. So that is the number I'm going to add and subtract. So it's x squared minus 5x plus this number minus this number plus 1 equals 0. All right, I cut my number in half. I squared it. That's what's going in here. 25 over 4 and 25 over 4. Okay, these terms should factor nicely. Believe it or not, you may not think they do, but they do. All right, x minus, remember it's the number you squared. We squared a negative 5/2. So there's my minus 5/2. And now, just use your calculator and add those together. Negative 24 over 5 plus 1. I get negative 21 over 4 in my calculator. Math Frac will put it back in a fraction, no crazy decimals. Rewrite this puppy out twice. X minus 5/2 squared. add that 21 over 4 over, so it's going to equal a positive 21 over 4. Okay. To get rid of that square, I'm going to square root. Don't forget the plus minus. I get x minus 5/2 equals plus or minus. Remember, it's really radical 21 over radical 4. Okay. So I get x minus 5/2 equals plus or minus radical 21 all over 2. I know the square root of 4 is 2. And lastly, I just have to add my 5/2 over. So I get 5/2 plus or minus radical 21 over 2. All right, well, if you're feeling confident, then you're probably good to take pause here in your notes, and we'll see you tomorrow. If you're not confident, you need to go back and rewatch it. Have a great night. We'll see you then.